9 days after South Korea lodged a WTO complaint over Japan's trade curbs, Tokyo agreed on September 20th to hold a bilateral consultation to deal with the complaint.
輸出管理の運用見直しにつきまして、韓国から要請のあった WTO 協定に基づく協議につきまして、本日これを受け入れることといたしました。
Holding the bilateral consultation is the first step of the WTO dispute settlement. Should the two sides fail to find a middle ground through the talks in 60 days, South Korea can ask the WTO to establish an appellate body. It could take 3 years until the final ruling is made. Despite the trade measures, South Korea currently remains as Japan's third largest trade partner. Since Japanese exports to Korea are worth nearly $7.2 billion more than its imports, South Korea is logging the third largest trade surplus with Japan after the US and Hong Kong. Tokyo's retaliation is starting to take its toll on its economy. It is to be seen whether the WTO's intervention could resolve the ongoing trade rift between South Korea and Japan.
Hello, welcome to The Point. I'm your host, Daniel Che. The Seoul-Tokyo trade dispute, which got ignited in July, is now being handled by the WTO. So, how would the lawsuit impact the outcome of the ongoing dispute between the two sides? And what about the forecast for South Korea's exports? For some answers to these questions and more, we're joined by a panel of experts. So, let's get to the point. To help us dissect today's topic into digestible bites, we're joined by Professor Kim Byung-ju, Professor of International Studies from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies and a regular contributor to Arirang TV. Thank you so much for making time for us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, first of all, Professor, it looks like South Korea taking Japan's export curbs to WTO seemed like an inevitable progression. What's your take on that?
Well, obviously, when Japan took the July 1st action of announcing the export control on their own, based on their own reasons of South Korea failing the export control management and not preventing effectively about the inflow of sensitive products into perhaps countries like North Korea. When they took that action, it seemed quite obvious that this case would have to go to the WTO. So overall, that's the progression we've been expecting, and the overall direction of progress has been, in this sense, I guess, no surprise.
Right. So the playing ground, or the competitive field, now it's shifted to the WTO, which means they are going to be stressing their points based on the articles of GATT, GATT, and
right.
What will be the focal point of their arguments, first off?
Well, MFN is the keyword for Korea, most favored nation, meaning that, well, actually the wording actually means opposite thing, meaning that non-discrimination. And non-discrimination, in this case, what Korea is arguing is that Japan, by announcing this kind of export control, Japan is taking Korea out and not treating Korea just like other members of the WTO. And so that will be the key argument. But however, Korean government has lined up a long list of legal arguments spanning into not only the MFN cause of the General Agreement of Tariff and Trade, but also even agreement on the IPR, intellectual property rights, agreement on investment, and agreement on services. There is a long list of technical details about that accuse Japan of violating WTO spirit. But however, as I said, the main point, the central point will be MFN. And MFN, let's keep in mind, is the central idea of WTO and the GATT before WTO. So this is a very strong argument that Korea is making against Japan.
Now, Tokyo agreed to hold consultation with Seoul over the complaint. So that's the first step of the WTO dispute settlement, we believe.
Right.
And Japan's economy officials and new cabinet members, they are diplomatic hardliners, though. How do you anticipate they will approach the talks?
Of course, looking at the new lineup of Japanese cabinet, looks like these hardliners, having hardliners would not probably help in terms of those people who would like to see a more peaceful resolution of this case. As you indicated, the Minister of Industry and Economy, for instance, the new face, his name is Sugawara Issue, and Minister Sugawara himself has made clear several times that South Korea bears a strict burden on this case, and South Korea needs to be blamed, and he has made it clear that Japan is going to fight hard on this case as well. A second point of concern would be new Foreign Minister Motegi Toshimitsu. Minister Motegi himself is very much of a hardliner, and he has made clear again and again that South Korea is to blame on this case as well. So, the lineup of new cabinet ministers of Japan does not help for those, as I mentioned, those who want a more peaceful resolution of this case. So what we will probably see is that WTO will see quite an intensive fight between the two countries.
So it seems like Japan is looking to push forward with set goals instead of negotiate or talk out the facts that should be lined up. So how will the WTO and the rest of the world perceive Japan's aggressive maneuver in approaching this settlement?
Right. I guess it depends on whom to ask in terms of like what kind of resolution we want. But at this point, as I said, Japanese ministers, not only one but several ministers, and including perhaps even Prime Minister, has indicated that Japan wants to win in this case. And so when they have the bilateral consultations, probably what we are expecting is Japan making very strong argument against Korea's claims, and Korea's side not really budging on that case. So for a while at least, I know there are several scholars who are expecting some kind of peaceful resolution at the stage of bilateral consultation. And I'm not exactly on that side. I'm expecting a very tough argument being exchanged from both sides at the time of bilateral exchange. And after that, we will have to go to the WTO panel to make a decision on that.
Right, they are expected to make a very calculated and careful approach nonetheless. Mm-hmm. Now, we'll be turning to a third party's perspective this time for another expert's point of view. We'll get back to you in a short while. Okay. So it's time to talk with a legal expert on some of the points South Korea and Japan could make at the WTO dispute settlement. Raj Bala, distinguished professor at University of Kansas Law School and senior advisor at Dentons, is joining us via Skype. Hello, Professor.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you.
Likewise, the pleasure is ours. Once the case gets underway, Professor, South Korea would most likely rely on Articles 1, 10, and 11 of GATT to stress its points. What kind of arguments would the two sides make?
South Korea has legitimate grievances under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, and other World Trade Organization rules. Going right to your question on the merits of the Korean claim, the first argument is under GATT Article 1, the very famous most favored nation principle. No other country was treated thusly by Japan. Taiwan and Singapore remained on the list for bulk export eligibility. So that's one argument now that Korea is making. Now, Japan does not have an automatic defense under the MFN rule. However, it can make a few points. One is, first, there is no right of any WTO member to receive an export. I mean, Japan is not required to export these three items if it does not want to. The second legal claim that the Korean government is making against Japan is under Article 11, Paragraph 1 of GATT. That's the famous rule against quantitative restrictions. Now, how might Japan defend against the Article 11.1 claim? Well, first, it could invoke national security. Again, we hope it doesn't do that, but it could. And now, the third claim that the Korean government has brought is under GATT Article 10. That's the famous rule about transparency. And what Korea pointed out was that Japan implemented its removal of Korea from the bulk export list and put it on this individual export list requirement for licensing. It did that on July 1st, and it started implementing this new measure 3 days later. so that Korea never really had a chance to give comments, and it had very little notice. Now, Japan has a few defenses here. The first is Japan will argue it was negotiating in good faith with Korea for upwards of 3 years before this became a World Trade Organization case, and that Korea was not engaging with Japan in the negotiations.
Professor Bala, then, to what extent, I mean, this is a central question about this discussion here. To what extent do you think this bilateral consultation, which is ongoing or underway right now, will contribute to eventual resolution of this case?
Yes, I think there's a very good opportunity for Japan and Korea to resolve this conflict through consultations. Under the Dispute Settlement Understanding, DSU, of the World Trade Organization, there is automatically a notice and comment period, generally 60 days. And that period can be extended. And that's a period for the two sides, the complainant, Korea, and the respondent, Japan, to negotiate a diplomatic settlement. And many, many cases since the WTO was born and the DSU started to be used by the members, many, dozens, hundreds of cases have settled and not gone the full adjudicatory process of a panel and an appellate body proceeding. I might also point out that if by December 19th of this year, there are no new appellate body members, then the appellate body will cease to function. So Korea will lose, and Japan will lose, the ability to appeal any adverse panel decisions that might be in the case. And so that in itself is an incentive for the two sides to settle the case, because they won't have, as it were, a Supreme Court to which to appeal in Geneva. Now, there's another incentive to settle. If the case were to go to a panel, the panel, under standard WTO rules and practices, will submit in confidence a copy in draft form of the panel report. If either, so both sides will see that. It'll be submitted, that panel report, just to the complainant, Korea, and the respondent, Japan. That gives an opportunity for the two sides to look at that report and see, maybe we should settle this case because it's obvious the panel has ruled against us, whether that's Japan that might be losing the case or Korea that might be losing the case. And that happens also in WTO practice.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Bala, for your time and your insights today. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to appear on the program. I'm delighted and honored to be with you.
Thank you again. Well, it looks like the complicated procedure, and it will take a long time once it's turned over to the WTO. Do you think the dispute settlement will provide some type of a solution or a direction towards a solution in this ongoing bilateral conflict?
If we're talking about the ongoing bilateral conflict in the big picture, I don't think it will make a real big difference. We have to separate this WTO technical question of export control on one hand, that being as a part of the big picture of a bilateral conflict. I don't think WTO process itself will fundamentally help. We could see, as Professor Raj Bala said, maybe we could see a resolution at the stage of bilateral consultation. And then maybe if we have appellate body, as he pointed out, if we have a full appellate body, maybe we'll see some kind of resolution at the end of this tunnel. But however, as a general case, WTO takes such a long time. Many of these cases that we have gone through, I mean, this is not the first time we have gone through the disagreements and conflict with Japan before, and we have had other cases, and they took like 2-3 years time. So time is one, and then usually WTO appellate body, when they actually produces their ruling, often their wordings are pretty vague, and either side can claim their victory. So that adds to that, and then of course, even though WTO is different from the previous body, GATT, it has greater power for enforcing its rulings, but however, it's still limited. Fundamentally, WTO cannot force, for instance, if Korea wins, it cannot strongly force Japan to take an action according to the WTO ruling. So there are all these limitations, and then they take a long time. So that's why I'm saying WTO is not probably going to be a real way of dealing with the entire big picture of the conflict between the two countries.
Right, in terms of trade conflict and WTO trying to play the mediator role, would you say it is a more positive step compared to just the two sides being involved in the argument themselves, or a third party like, let's say, the U.S. Coming in as a mediator?
Yeah, that's a good point. Having WTO is a definite plus. But there is a different question between whether the WTO process will resolve the issue. As I said, it's going to be difficult. But having WTO is definitely a plus. Having United States as a third party, as a party that can intervene and mediate, that's another plus as well. So, for those of us who want a resolution of this conflict, we need everything we can get. And WTO is definitely an important addition to it. That I don't deny it.
All right, we'll take a quick look at a clip that we've prepared, Professor. Now, Korea should thoroughly prepare the case to let the world know about Japan's unfair trade practices. Meanwhile, concerns for Korean exports are rising due to the prolonged trade span. Before we move on to the next topic, let's take a look at the clip.
Despite placing export curbs on key items to South Korea for the past 2 months, Japan saw its exports to Korea continuously rise. Due to the export growth, Seoul remains Tokyo's third largest trade partner even after the start of the trade dispute. According to Tokyo's data, Japan's outbound shipments to South Korea have accounted for 6.9% of its total exports in August, up 0.3% from that of July. The outcome could be explained by the fact that 3 items under Japan's export curbs accounted for less than 1% of its total exports to South Korea. A significant drop in its exports to China due to the ongoing US-China trade war has also played the part as well. Japan posted a trade deficit in August due to the trade spat. Its exports have slumped 8.2% from a year earlier, while its imports have slipped 12% year-on-year. Even though South Korea has been Japan's third largest trade partner for the past 2 decades, the continuing boycott of Japanese goods and other measures, including the whitelist revision and the WTO complaint, are adding more uncertainties to the bilateral trade relations. It would be interesting to see whether if Japan would tweak its stance and start retracting export curbs against South Korea due to its sluggish trade numbers.
So Japan's exports to Korea were expected to dip following its trade curbs on strategic items. But according to government data, Korea is still the third largest trading partner for Japan after the US and Hong Kong. So why is that?
The critical answer to that would be those 3 categories of products that are being kind of now newly managed and controlled by the Japanese government, or to be controlled or managed, to be precise about it, because they have announced that they are not going to do it this time. They announced 2 cases of letting go, right? But in the future, if they do so, even if they do so, the amounts of these products that takes up within the entire package of Japanese exports to Korea, it's very small. It's far less than 1% of the entire Japanese exports to Korea. So it's a sensitive item. It's a critical item that could potentially affect Korea's key exports to other countries from Korea using this material as an input material. But as its volume, its volume that takes up between the 2 countries in bilateral trade, very, very tiny. That's why we don't see big change in terms of the trade volume after the announcement by Japan at the beginning of July.
Moving on to another issue that's impacting Japan in some way, shape, or form, definitely, is the boycott of Japanese goods that's still going strong and growing here in Korea. For instance, beer imports from Japan plummeted 97% on year. Car sales also halved. Did Tokyo expect this when they were making this unilateral trade measure against South Korea?
Right. We have different kinds of evidence showing that Japan and Japanese government, particularly Abe government, has worked very hard to calculate and plan ahead what kind of impact it will make when they made that July 1st announcement. But a lot of reports are coming out saying that actually Japanese government is in taken aback by the reaction from Korea in reaction to this kind of Japanese actions. And so all these things happening right now inside Korea, refusing to buy Japanese products, and then Korean travelers and tourists changing their minds about going to Japan. These things are a big surprise in the minds of the Arab governments. We see many evidence here. And one important point to keep in mind at this point is that these actions by Korea being taken at this point could actually have big impact as we go forward. We were just talking about the statistics for this past summer, July and August and so on, but it will continue to have bigger and bigger effect down the road as we see numbers coming in. So it's a very important issue of concern in the minds of the Abe government.
Right. We have our second Skype connection ready, so let's speak to another foreign expert that's joining us. Time now for our second session with an expert, an economy expert this time. David S. Lee, Senior Lecturer of Business and Economics at Hong Kong University, is here with us. David, welcome to our program.
Hello, it's great to be back again.
Great to have you back with us again. David, Korea is still a big player in terms of Japan's export. Tokyo's trade numbers are sliding, while Seoul still remains its third largest trading partner. What do these factors indicate about the trade conflict?
Well, I think that's interesting. I think maybe the first thing is we don't want to take too much influence, I guess, from just monthly trade numbers. We probably want to see how things are at the end of the year. I imagine, because of the nature of the Japan-South Korea trade relationship, that ultimately, in terms of South Korea, Japan being 3 or 4 or whatever the number ends up being, ultimately, I don't think by the end of the year, when we look at the annual statistics, that it will be very much different than it historically has been. Part of the reason I think for that is a lot of the goods that have been affected, so for example, the chemicals that Japan has placed on some sort of export control, those actually in the aggregate make up only a small portion of the total exports or trade volume between Korea and Japan. And so at the end of the day, maybe we don't want to read too much into the monthly numbers and kind of see how things look at the end of the year when we have more annual numbers.
We'll need to take a look at the big numbers as time progresses. So how do you see the prolonging conflict continuing to damage bilateral trade ties?
Well, that's also a kind of a difficult question in the sense of you have the economic side of it, the business side of it, but you also have kind of the human element, the psychological side of it. And so I think at this point, both governments have kind of probably reached a certain plateau in the sense that I don't think either side really wants to escalate this any further. And so on that level, these are type of things that potentially could be corrected. But what's happening in addition to kind of the economic trade issues are that, there's a lack of people-to-people kind of interaction now. So you have low, basically, tourism volume, both, Japan to Korea, Korea to Japan. And I think those kind of emotional and psychological kind of interactions are more difficult to recover. And in some respects, even more important. Right? I think in a lot of previous disputes that Japan and Korea have had in the last, let's say, 5-10 years, it might have been a government dispute, but it didn't always get to this emotional level where, like in Korea, where we have wide-scale boycott of Japanese products. And so, again, this is become an emotional thing, and that'll be interesting to see if that will be able to recover, because ultimately, at the end of the day, Japan and Korea are neighbors. They're both key allies to the United States. They're both large developed economies, et cetera. And so, they need each other. And if we continue to fray these human-to-human interactions, I think in the long run, that could actually be more problematic.
David, thank you so much for your time and your expertise on this subject.
Thank you. Great to be with you today.
Now, coming back to you, Professor, most analysts suggest Seoul-Tokyo dispute would have a bigger impact around the world than anticipated initially. How much uncertainties does it add to the global economy?
Let's just think about some of the iPhones, for instance, or Hyundai Motor cars, for instance, right? What's happening right now is these Japanese, materials that Japanese government wants to control in terms of selling to Korea, they could become important part of Samsung Electronics chips that could go into iPhones. In that case, what happens? It affects United States exports to China or elsewhere around the world. This is a huge ripple effect we can think about ahead of time and in the long run, for instance. And the same story goes about Hyundai cars, for instance, right? These chips could go into these kind of cars, and they can, these cars may be produced elsewhere around the world, Canada, United States, or different countries around in Europe, for instance, even in Eastern Europe. So this is the ripple effect that can go through the multiple layers of global supply chains. So this has a very serious potential, if everything goes wrong, potential to very negatively affect the global economy as a whole. And that's why a lot of people are getting upset about the prospect or possibility of these things going wrong. And I think the Abe government is aware of that. The Moon government here is aware of that. So therefore, that's, in that sense, I agree with Professor Lee's observation that the likelihood of the whole things going continuously negative is rather limited. But we'll have to wait and see on that because we have a political landscape that's just behind our back here in Korea as well as in Japan.
A lot of time has passed, and we're not seeing any signs of improvement, neither side budging, nor taking time to really listen to each other. How do you anticipate this conflict brewing or slowly fizzling down in the near future?
You know, the domestic politics, as I mentioned, is one of the key critical variable that we should keep in mind. But the business side, of course, there is a growing consensus, that we see a business community in Korea, in Japan, in the United States, elsewhere in Europe, for instance, that want no further escalation of this case. So they will act as a force against further escalation, continued chicken game of this on one hand. But however, if political leadership like Abe, Prime Minister Abe and President Moon fail to control the emotions of domestic politics in Korea here and in Japan there as well, we could see further escalation. So this is two forces acting against one another. The political force, nationalism, emotions going for the escalation on one hand, then actual, solid, tangible economic gains and interests that everybody shares. Korean business, Japanese business, American business, European business, everybody share together on one hand going against the escalation and further the continuation of the chicken game. So we'll have to wait and see how these two opposite forces sort out each other or neutralize each other. We'll have to wait and see on that one.
Well, we'll hope that logic and facts prevail in the long run. This is where we have to wrap things up. Professor Kim Byung-Ju, thank you so much for coming. We appreciate you being here to make our program complete today.
Thank you.
Japan's new foreign minister said Seoul has overturned the foundation of the two countries' relationship. But for the sake of future-oriented bilateral ties, we hope Tokyo take time for self-reflection and understand those who do not remember and acknowledge the past are condemned to repeat it. That's all we have for you at this hour. Do join us again, same time next week for a brand new episode of The Point. Thank you for watching.